Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The air around Helen Orgy's grave that afternoon was unnaturally still, like the moment before lightning slices through sky, charged, quiet, waiting. Not a bird chirped. Even the wind that had earlier teased headscarves and lifted the hems of mourning wrappers now seemed to pause, holding its breath with the rest of the crowd. Gray clouds stitched tightly above the fictional town of Illington gave the day a bruised sky, as if heaven itself had questions it couldn't answer. Yet the man who stood nearest to the casket, Desmond Orgy, showed no signs of grief. He wore a freshly ironed wine-colored agbada that shimmered ever so slightly with every tilt of the sun, a royal shade not befitting sorrow, but arrogance cloaked in silk. His eyes, sharp and empty, stared not at the coffin but beyond it, as if he'd buried her long before this day. Tucked neatly beneath his arm was a woman whose appearance whispered scandal, Sheila, curvy, composed, and clearly not a blood relative. Her black lace gown hugged her figure in ways that should have been inappropriate for a funeral, and her face, barely visible beneath a sheer veil, bore the subtle smirk of someone who believed they'd won. The mourners behind them, dressed like forgotten secrets in shades of charcoal and pitch, exchanged murmurs that rippled louder than the priest's final benediction. When the coffin was finally lowered, the sound of soil meeting would echoed like a gavel. One thud, then another. It wasn't just a body being buried. It was a woman's silence, her truth, and the final nail to a life some thought they understood. By evening, Helen's once vibrant house had turned into a quiet museum of discomfort. Her scent, a mix of lavender and camphor, still lingered faintly in corners, clinging to curtains and cushions like a final goodbye that refused to leave. Yet nothing else about her presence remained untouched. Desmond, now draped in a casual white caftan, strolled through the living room with the confidence of a man reclaiming territory he believed had always been his. In his hands were the keys to her locked drawer, which he'd broken open after everyone left. A faded photograph of their wedding day lay face down on the floor beside a broken ceramic mug. Sheila, barefoot and confident, waltzed into the space carrying a wine glass, glancing around like an interior decorator deciding what to erase. "This couch has to go," she muttered, flopping herself on it anyway. "Too old. Too soft." Desmond didn't respond. His eyes lingered on a journal left on the bookshelf, its spine bent from years of secret use. He didn't reach for it yet. Instead, he pulled out an envelope marked next of kin, to be handled only by bank. Sheila peeked over his shoulder like a cat watching prey, her eyes gleaming with something close to greed. "Tomorrow morning," she said, almost in a whisper. "We go straight to Peaceline. I want everything handled before the week runs out." Desmond nodded slowly, as if calculating the digits of inheritance already. Neither of them noticed the housekeeper, Mama Acom, standing quietly at the kitchen door, holding Helen's apron in her hands like a shroud. She watched them for a moment, her lips sealed, her heart heavy, then turned back into the kitchen, where Helen's Bible still lay open beside a bowl of soaked beans. Desmond arrived at Peaceline Microfinance Bank the next day with an energy that reeked more of triumph than mourning. The security guard at the entrance barely finished his greeting before Desmond brushed past, dragging Sheila behind him like a queen with too much perfume and not enough patience. Inside, the bank smelt of polish, processed air, and paperwork, everything Helen had once hated about the financial world. They were led into a private office where a middle-aged man with rounded glasses sat behind a glass desk, his name tag reading Branch Manager Mr. Ajayi. He greeted them politely, took the envelope Desmond handed over, and began to scan the contents. Desmond sat back, legs crossed, fingers lightly tapping the armrest in anticipation. Sheila crossed her legs too, her foot swinging confidently. But something in the manager's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight wrinkle of the brow, a tightening around the jaw. Desmond noticed it immediately. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone smooth, but with an edge sharpened by greed. Mr. Ajayi looked up calmly. "Well, sir, you are listed here as the husband of the deceased, which is noted. However, the directive in her file names a different person as the sole beneficiary." The room fell into a sudden hush that drowned even the hum of the air conditioner. Sheila laughed nervously. "You must be joking. He's her husband. Who else could she have listed?" Mr. Ajayi adjusted his glasses and said the name slowly, as though it required reverence. "Lawrence Adeli." Desmond stiffened. "That name means nothing to me." The banker nodded. "And yet it means everything to her. Your wife updated her account instructions 1 year ago. It was notarized, recorded, and locked in legal compliance. I'm afraid this isn't a negotiable matter." The silence that followed stretched too long to be casual. Desmond's throat tightened, his fingers pausing their tap, his leg no longer crossing anything. Sheila leaned forward, her face drained of color under her foundation. "There must be an error," she said flatly. "Check again." But Mr. Ajayi was already standing, retrieving a file from his locked cabinet. He returned with documents bearing Helen's signature, thumbprint, and a notarized video transcript logged on the system. "Your wife came here in person," he explained, his voice as still as a pond hiding depth. "She verified everything. She left no room for dispute. She even left a message for whoever might contest it." He pressed a button on a tablet and turned it toward them. There, in a soft scarf and eyeglasses, Helen's recorded face appeared. She looked calm, calmer than she ever had in her final months. "If you're watching this," she began, "then I'm gone. And if you've come expecting to collect what you never earned, then let this be my last word. I loved quietly, I suffered privately, but I planned wisely. Everything I had goes to my son, Lawrence Adeli." Not because he asked, but because he never made me feel small. As the video ended, Desmond sat motionless, his heart pounding like drums during war. He had buried her body. But clearly, Helen hadn't buried her voice. And now, it was speaking from beyond the grave, with precision, with grace, and with undeniable finality. The name Lawrence Adeli floated in Desmond's ears like smoke trapped in a bottle. It wasn't just unfamiliar, it was unwanted. It didn't belong to any of Helen's cousins, nor her church friends, nor even those distant relatives she used to call people from my mother's side. The room seemed to narrow. The air thickened. Desmond stared at the bank manager as though the man had spoken in parables meant only for angels to interpret. Lawrence? Who the hell was Lawrence? And how could a ghost of a name be strong enough to hijack what Desmond believed was his birthright through marriage? Sheila straightened her blouse, blinking furiously like a pageant queen, realizing her crown was missing. "There must be a mistake," she muttered. "He is her husband. I mean, he was." But the legal officer stood unmoved, arms folded, the kind of posture that says, "We've seen this before, and we'll see it again." Desmond leaned forward, tone raised, but laced with shaky pride. "I buried that woman. I paid for her coffin. I carried her in the rain." "Now you're telling me some stranger gets everything." The manager, still seated, didn't flinch. She filed the update herself, in person, with a video recording and biometric confirmation. "We cross-verified it. The directive is sealed with legal backing. Mr. Lawrence Adeli is listed as the only beneficiary to all financial assets within our institution." The final nail had been hammered, not into Helen's coffin, but into Desmond's delusions. He stormed out of the bank like a bull whose horns had been clipped in public. Sheila followed, trying to keep up, her heels striking the pavement with frustration. He didn't say a word as they got into the car. He just drove. Fast, furious, unthinking. The city blurred past the windows like a bad memory being chased down by truth. Sheila finally broke the silence. "You didn't know she had a child?" Desmond didn't answer. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was chewing stones. "I mean, maybe she had him before you met. Maybe she was raped or something. Or maybe it was one of those things women hide to protect themselves." Her words were meant to console, but they stung. Desmond didn't like being in the dark, especially when the switch had been beside him all along. They reached home, and he threw the car keys on the center table as if blaming them for not unlocking Helen's secrets earlier. "This doesn't make sense," he finally said. "If she had a son, where was he during the burial? Why didn't he show face?" Sheila, now barefoot and pacing, hissed under her breath. "Maybe he didn't want attention. Or maybe, just maybe, he doesn't want to deal with you." Desmond shot her a glare sharp enough to slice glass. "He's just a boy," he said, "and he has no idea what's coming. I'll find him. And when I do, he'll hand over what belongs to me." But what Desmond didn't know was that Helen had planned for this very moment, not with weapons, but with wisdom. That evening, in a quiet part of the guest room Helen once kept locked, Desmond forced open a small wooden cabinet. Inside were stacks of old receipts, handwritten letters, and a leather-bound journal. It smelled of lavender and old secrets. He flipped through it, page after page of Helen's elegant handwriting, like ink dripping from a quiet soul. Some entries spoke of loneliness, others of longing, but most spoke of a boy named Lawrence. The story unfolded slowly. She had him when she was 19. Her parents forced her to give him up. She never forgave them. When she married Desmond, she was already searching. She didn't tell him because, as her words said, his pride would never let him love what didn't come from him. Desmond paused, heart thudding, as one page fell open with a photograph tucked in. It showed a young man, dark-skinned, with Helen's nose and quiet eyes. The back was labeled, "Lawrence, First Reunion, November 18th. Sheila, now standing in the doorway, looked at the photo and hissed softly. "He looks normal. Not even that fine." Desmond ignored her. The next entry read, "He didn't want my money, but I insisted. I told him to take it in case I'm not here tomorrow. He cried. I cried. We held hands under the mango tree at the old orphanage. I told him, I owe you a life." That sentence pierced deeper than a knife. Desmond sat down slowly, the journal still open in his lap. For the first time since Helen's death, he felt something real, not anger, not greed, but something that resembled shame. Days passed like forgotten debts, lingering, unwanted, yet present. Desmond called two of Helen's sisters, hoping to gather more information about Lawrence. One didn't pick up. The other, Agnes, laughed coldly when she heard his voice. "Now you want to ask about her child? You think Helen didn't know about your concubine? We knew, Desmond. We just didn't want to fight her battles for her. She had a plan, and you walked right into it with that lipstick-wearing cockroach you keep beside you." The insult didn't cut as much as the realization that Helen had built a wall of silence high enough to protect her final wish. He went through her belongings again, checked her Bible margins, phone gallery, even her makeup purse. Everywhere the pieces pointed to Lawrence. She had wired him money under disguised business names. She had bought a flat in Port Averton in his name. She had even changed her next of kin 2 months before her final admission to the hospital. Sheila grew restless. "So what now? We just give up?" Desmond didn't answer. He had begun to see that the fight wasn't with Lawrence. It was with himself, the version of himself that believed Helen would die quietly and leave no fingerprints on her truth. Now, the truth was crawling out of every drawer like roaches awakened by light. In the mirror, Desmond saw a man unraveling, not from poverty, but from revelation. Not from loss, but from being exposed. Lawrence, the boy no one expected, had become the chapter Desmond never wanted to read. And yet there it was, printed in bold, signed in silence, sealed in love. The rain came without warning, slapping rooftops like hands, clapping at a funeral no one wanted to attend. In the dim light of early evening, Desmond sat at the far end of his late wife's veranda, the old cane chair creaking beneath him like a tired conscience. His feet were bare, grounded in dust that used to feel like home. The house no longer spoke to him. It watched him, silently accusing, walls holding secrets he hadn't earned the right to know. In his hand was Helen's old phone, now unlocked through the fingerprints she left behind on its cracked screen. The more he scrolled, the more it felt like trespassing into a garden that bloomed only for the one who watered it. Pictures of Lawrence filled an entire hidden folder. Photos of birthdays he wasn't invited to, screenshots of transfer receipts with coded descriptions like book rent and youth fund, and voice notes between mother and son that cracked Desmond's pride open like a coconut tossed against concrete. In one clip, Helen whispered, "If anything happens to me, just know I chose you long before I met him." The phone slipped from Desmond's grip, landing screen down like it couldn't bear to face him either. Somewhere behind him, Sheila's voice echoed from the hallway. "Are we going to keep acting like this is normal? You're sulking like a widower who didn't already move on before the woman died." He didn't respond. His ears had grown weary of her tone, a mix of entitlement and desperation that now sounded like a spoon scratching an empty pot. Sheila had stopped cooking. The kitchen smelled like old onions and pride. She now ordered food and ate alone in the room that used to be Helen's. Desmond no longer joined her at night. His body lay beside her, but his mind wandered down paths lined with questions and regrets. That morning, he had sent a private investigator to Port Averton with instructions to find Lawrence Udderly. He gave no details about the reason, only that it was family business, the kind that doesn't need to sit in court but can destroy a man's peace all the same. Sheila didn't know about the search. She was too busy combing through Helen's wardrobe for something of value. "Can we sell her jewelry? Her rings? I mean, if we can't touch the bank money, at least let's take something." Her words soured the air. Desmond snapped, "Do you even hear yourself?" She shot back with venom. "Yes, I do. And it's the same voice that told you not to waste time on a dying woman." The argument ended not with a bang, but with the sound of drawers slammed shut and a door locked from inside. Desmond returned to Helen's journal that night. He sat under the weak yellow light of the reading lamp she used to adore, the kind that cast long shadows when you read the truth too closely. He opened to the last pages, and there, written in firm script, was a letter addressed to him. Not my husband, not Desmond, just to the man I married. His hands trembled slightly as he read. The letter didn't burn. It bled. Word by word, Helen peeled back layers of silence that had thickened between them like years stacked upon each other. "I knew," she began, "from the moment your lies began to linger in your perfume. I knew when the calls became short and your nights became long. I never asked, because what is more painful than betrayal is begging the betrayer to admit it. But in the silence, I planned, not out of revenge, out of dignity. You took my laughter, but I would not let you take my son." Desmond paused, exhaling through lips that felt like borrowed skin. The letter continued. "I gave Lawrence up once, because I was too young and too scared. When I found him again, I promised myself never to lose him, not even to death. I knew you wouldn't understand. You'd say I hid him. But the truth is, I protected him from the version of you I couldn't change." Desmond dropped the paper on his lap, eyes glassy, throat tight. In those moments, his life no longer looked like a timeline, but a courtroom. Helen's words the witness, his actions the accused. The pain wasn't in her truth. It was in how carefully she had carried it, how lovingly she left him out of the future she prepared. Desmond closed the letter and stared into the dark corridor. For the first time in weeks, he felt utterly alone, Not the kind of loneliness that comes from absence, but the kind that blooms when the presence you've taken for granted finally lets go. The next morning, Desmond received a call from the investigator. Lawrence had been found. He lived in a modest apartment in the outskirts of Port Averton, working as a digital artist for a local media firm. The man described him as quiet, polite, but guarded. Desmond dressed in silence, choosing a shirt Helen had bought for him years ago. Sheila, now curled up on the couch scrolling through her phone, barely looked up. "Where are you going?" she asked, voice coated in indifference. "To meet the future," Desmond replied, picking up the car keys with fingers that felt strangely weak. The drive was long, the road winding like a serpent unsure of its destination. When he arrived at the small compound, Lawrence stood by a plantain tree trimming the leaves with careful hands. He looked up, brows furrowed, unsure. "Yes?" Desmond cleared his throat. "You don't know me, but I knew your mother. I was her husband." Lawrence didn't speak. He simply nodded and gestured to a bench under the tree. Desmond sat, palms on his knees, unsure where to begin. "She left everything to you," he said quietly. "Even the things I thought belonged to me." Lawrence looked at him, eyes calm. "I didn't ask for it. She insisted. She said it was time someone she loved had a head start." Desmond smiled bitterly. "And what do you plan to do with it?" Lawrence leaned forward. "Build. The kind of life she deserved." There was no gloating, no pride, just the quiet voice of a man who had loved a mother enough not to hate her choices. And for once, Desmond had no rebuttal. Only the echo of a woman who spoke through her absence, louder than she ever had in her presence. The sky above Port Averton rolled with quiet clouds, the kind that looked like thoughts yet to be formed. Desmond sat alone in the compound of a guest house he checked into after leaving Lawrence's apartment. He hadn't gone back to Illington, nor had he called Sheila. His phone lay untouched on the table beside a cold bottle of malt drink he couldn't bring himself to open. He wasn't sure what held him there, shame, reflection, or perhaps the ghost of a truth finally catching up with him after years of outrunning himself. That bench under the plantain tree had exposed him more than any courtroom ever could. Lawrence hadn't shouted. He hadn't asked for anything. He simply listened, spoke softly, and left the door open on his way back inside. Desmond could still hear Helen's voice in the silence, not angry, not bitter, but exhausted. He stared at the floor tiles, counting the cracks as though somewhere between the grout lines he'd find the man he used to be. What surprised him most wasn't that Helen had left everything to her son. It was that she had loved him all the same, even as he loved someone else right under her nose. She knew. That was the thorn in his chest now. She had known about Sheila, yet never once demanded an explanation. That kind of silence wasn't weakness. It was a quiet thunder, one that chose peace over noise, and dignity over confrontation. The deeper he thought, the more he realized that Helen had played a long, silent game of truth, while he had played a short, loud game of deceit. Back home in Illington, Sheila was unraveling. She paced the living room like a cat in a burning house, eyes darting toward the entrance each time a sound stirred. It had been 3 days since Desmond left without a proper word. Her calls went unanswered. Her messages remained unread. She had tried to be calm, to act unaffected, but each tick of the clock gnawed at her nerves like termites in a wooden frame. In desperation, she called Agnes, Helen's elder sister, hoping to fish for information through veiled curiosity. "I just want to check on Desmond," she said with forced humility, twisting her voice into something that resembled concern. Agnes didn't even pretend to be polite. "He's exactly where he needs to be, far away from you." Click. The line went dead. Sheila flung the phone on the cushion, breathing hard. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had followed the script: stay close, stay patient, wait for the woman to pass, then reap the harvest. But now the field was empty, the barn locked, and the farmer had disappeared with the only key. She tried to distract herself with television, food, even an old romance novel, but nothing worked. Her frustration festered. Then, in a moment of panic disguised as clarity, she picked up Desmond's second phone, the one Helen never touched, and scrolled through it for any clue. There, in his draft messages, sat a single line: "She left quietly, but she didn't leave without preparing a storm." Sheila's lips parted slightly. That storm was here now, and she was standing right in the eye of it. When Desmond finally returned, it was dusk again, Yellington's familiar sky painted in strokes of orange and blue like a tired painter deciding whether to finish or begin again. He entered the house slowly, his suitcase dragging behind him like a tale of unfinished stories. Sheila stood by the window, watching, arms folded tightly across her chest. "So you finally remembered where you live?" she asked, voice sharp but hollow. Desmond didn't reply. He simply walked past her and placed the suitcase beside the staircase. "I went to see him," he said flatly, without looking back. Sheila scoffed. "And? Did you threaten him? Did you scare him into giving you something?" Desmond turned slowly, face calm. "He didn't owe me anything. And he gave me more than I deserved, his time." Sheila blinked, stunned. This wasn't the man she knew. Desmond had always been fire, quick, loud, consuming. But now he sounded like rain, measured, cold, and quietly relentless. "You're not going to fight?" she asked. "You're just going to roll over and hand everything to him?" Desmond walked closer, then sat on the arm of the chair Helen once loved. "Do you know what he told me? He said he wants to build something in her name. Something quiet, something lasting. I've built nothing but disappointment, Sheila. Maybe it's time to let someone else try." Sheila didn't speak. Her lips trembled, but her pride forced her to straighten them. She looked around the house she thought she'd inherited and realized it was never hers. It was only borrowed, and the real owner had taken it with her when she left without saying goodbye. That night, the silence between them grew thicker than the walls. Desmond sat in the kitchen, sipping warm water, staring at nothing. Sheila stood in the hallway, a packed bag at her feet. "I'm leaving," she finally said. He nodded. "I figured." She waited, hoping for a plea, a reason to stay, but none came. "You know, I didn't plan it this way," she said, voice softer now. I thought we could start something real." Desmond didn't raise his head. "It was never real, Sheila. It was convenient. For both of us." Her eyes welled up, but the tears refused to fall. She picked up her bag, walked toward the door, then turned one last time. "She beat both of us, didn't she?" Desmond looked up, a faint, bitter smile curling his lips. "She didn't have to win. She just had to survive long enough to tell her truth." The door shut gently behind Sheila, no slamming, no shouting, just the final click of a chapter closing itself. Outside, the wind carried dust across the porch, sweeping away the footsteps of a woman who once thought she'd buried her competition. But the dead had a voice. And Helen's voice, though silent, had spoken in bank documents, in journals, in letters, and in the unshakable quiet of a son who now stood taller than any inheritance ever could. Desmond leaned back in the kitchen chair, eyes to the ceiling. No tears fell, but in his chest something cracked, not loud, but final. The days that followed Sheila's departure settled around the house like dust in corners no broom could reach. Desmond moved through the space like a man who'd returned to an empty hall after the applause had died down. The walls no longer echoed with familiar sounds, no television humming from the parlor, no heels striking tiles with entitlement, no laughter masking manipulation. The silence was so loud, it hummed like a generator with no fuel. In the solitude, Desmond found a rhythm he didn't expect, waking early, cleaning his own dishes, sometimes sitting at the edge of Helen's favorite chair and staring at the garden until the sky tilted its hat to dusk. He stopped going to the club. The men who once toasted with him and envied his blessings had begun whispering behind his back like rats that nibble only when the lights go off. Even Mama Ecom, the long-serving housekeeper, began keeping her distance, her eyes lowering any time he entered a room. He didn't blame her. For years, she had witnessed what Helen bore in silence. For years, she'd washed sheets and heard things no one should hear. And now, for the first time, Desmond understood the weight of footsteps on tiled floors when you walk alone in a house once filled with the quiet strength of a woman who smiled through storms. One morning, as he brewed tea in the kitchen Helen once ruled like a gentle queen, he found her old apron still hanging behind the door, faded, stained with palm oil, and smelling faintly of turmeric and thyme. He held it in his hands, and though no tears fell, something inside him broke again, soft and irreversible. Word eventually reached Desmond that Lawrence had returned to Illington, quietly, without any press or ceremony. He had been seen at the old Anglican church where Helen worshipped, helping repaint the children's Sunday school wing. He didn't use his mother's money to buy a new car, nor did he rent a flashy apartment or lodge in expensive hotels like people do when life suddenly tosses fortune into their laps. No, Lawrence moved through the town like a gentle ripple on still water, leaving traces of kindness that didn't announce themselves with trumpets. He even donated anonymously to the Widows' Fund, something Helen used to contribute to religiously every December. When Desmond heard about it from a former church member, he felt something twist inside him. Not jealousy, not resentment, but a bitter respect that tasted like truth, dipped in humility. One afternoon, driven by something he couldn't name, Desmond made his way to the same church. The walls smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and memories too stubborn to fade. He sat in the back pew and listened as the choir rehearsed hymns Helen used to hum while folding laundry. A voice behind him whispered, "Mr. Orgy?" He turned and found Lawrence, dressed in jeans and a simple shirt, holding a paintbrush and a rag. "I didn't expect to see you here," Lawrence said, not accusing, not surprised, just present. Desmond stood slowly, heart thudding against ribs that had grown quiet these past days. "I came to help," he said. And for once, he meant it. They worked side by side for hours without saying much. Desmond painted slowly, carefully, as though trying to atone for sins he couldn't name. Lawrence cleaned, repaired broken frames, and occasionally hummed old gospel tunes that made Desmond's chest tighten. At some point, Desmond sat on the edge of a pew and finally spoke, voice low. "You know, your mother never stopped loving you, even while loving me." "I don't know how she managed that kind of heart." Lawrence nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She didn't speak of you often. When she did, it wasn't with anger. Just sadness, like someone who wanted more but made peace with less." Desmond swallowed hard. "I failed her." Lawrence looked at him, then quietly replied, "Maybe. But you were part of her story." "And she wrote that story all the way to the end." Desmond lowered his head, eyes stinging. "I never thought I'd envy a son I didn't know existed." Lawrence smiled faintly. "She didn't raise me, but somehow she shaped me. Her letters, her calls, her advice, she gave even when it cost her everything. That's love." The church bell rang softly above them, calling to a time neither man could return to. Desmond stood, wiping paint from his palms like guilt from memory. "She trusted you with everything. Please, don't waste it." Lawrence nodded. "I don't plan to." They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. But something passed between them in that quiet space, something more binding than blood or apology. It was a recognition of pain, of growth, of Helen. By the time Desmond returned home, night had wrapped Illington in its shawl of stars and secrets. The porch light flickered, then steadied, as though it too had been waiting for some clarity. He stepped into the house, now void of chaos, and walked straight to Helen's old study. On the desk sat her journal, her reading glasses, and a photograph of her standing beside a tree in Port Averton, the same tree Desmond had seen in Lawrence's yard. He picked up the photo and stared at it for minutes that felt like hours. The expression on her face wasn't one of pain or triumph, but contentment, like a woman who had finally found the piece of her heart she lost in her youth. Desmond placed the photo down and opened her journal again, flipping to a page he hadn't noticed before. In her final entry, she had written, "I used to think love was loud, but real love is quiet. It watches, waits, and still chooses to give, even when it's forgotten. Even when it's betrayed, even when it's left behind." He closed the book, stood slowly, and looked around the room not as a conqueror, not as a widower, but as a man who had finally begun to understand. Outside, the wind danced with the trees, and in that dance, Desmond imagined Helen's laughter, soft, forgiving, eternal. He sat back in her chair, eyes closed, letting the quiet wrap around him like a second chance, one he hadn't earned, but one he would try to live worthy of. The month of August carried a gentler wind that year in Illington, as if the weather itself had decided to exhale some of the heaviness the past months had stored up in its corners. Desmond found himself waking earlier, not out of habit, but out of a new sense of purpose that didn't roar, but whispered. He no longer rushed to switch on his phone at dawn, waiting for bank alerts or business updates. He now rose with the sun, opened the windows, and listened, to birds, to silence, to himself. He'd begun volunteering quietly at the town's community school, the same one Helen had once supported anonymously, slipping envelopes of cash to the headmistress with a nod and no explanations. No one expected Desmond to show up with books and repaint classrooms with his own two hands. Some whispered it was guilt, others said it was madness, but the children didn't care. They saw a man kneeling to tie shoelaces, fixing broken chalkboards, and asking for nothing in return. One Friday afternoon, he sat with the pupils under the mango tree, telling them a story about a woman who planted love in places where even sorrow refused to grow. His voice didn't crack, but his eyes blinked against a breeze that didn't come from the wind. The children clapped when he finished, not because the story was exciting, but because it felt true. And that applause, softer than any crowd's roar he'd known in his prime, struck him deeper than he was ready to admit. Elsewhere in Illington, life was moving forward in soft but certain steps. Lawrence had taken possession of a modest duplex on the outskirts of town, far enough from the noise, but close enough to memory. He didn't change much inside. He kept Helen's old bookshelf, her favorite wall clock that chimed 5 minutes late, and even her embroidered throw blanket folded neatly on the couch. The house didn't need to be modernized. It just needed to breathe again. On weekends, Lawrence hosted 2 or 3 boys from the youth center, mentoring them quietly, guiding them through skills in digital design and creative writing. He didn't speak about Helen often, but her essence was everywhere, from the tea brand he offered his guests to the way he paused before responding to questions, as if measuring his words on the scale of kindness. One evening, he received a visitor, Desmond, dressed in a simple native wear, carrying a file and an envelope. They sat on the veranda as the crickets chirped in the distance like background singers in a song only the two of them could hear. Desmond handed him the envelope. "The house in Yola. She didn't put it in your name. I had it reassigned. And there's a small piece of land in her father's village. I think she would have wanted you to have that too." Lawrence took the envelope without a word, opened it, read, then closed it again. "Thank you," he said finally. Desmond nodded, his hands resting in his lap. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but it's what I have to give." Lawrence smiled faintly. Sometimes giving back isn't about fixing. It's just about not breaking anything further. And with that, they sat in the darkening quiet, 2 men bound not by blood, but by the same woman's light. Meanwhile, Whispers about Sheila's whereabouts trickled into town like smoke that couldn't be traced to any fire. Some said she relocated to Abuja and started a skincare business with a new partner. Others claimed she traveled abroad, chasing dreams that always seemed to slip through her fingers like sand in a careless palm. But no one knew for sure. She left no messages, no belongings behind, not even a shoe under Desmond's bed. And Desmond didn't ask. There was no need. What they had was never built to last. It was constructed on borrowed lies, and even those had an expiry date. Occasionally, he would glance at the hallway where her laughter once echoed and feel nothing. Not anger, not longing. Just a faint reminder of how far he had come. One Saturday morning, as he walked through the community market, he overheard two women whispering about him behind a stall filled with tomatoes. "That's him," one said, nudging the other. Imagine, after all that noise, now the woman way die still get the final say. The second woman giggled. God day write scripts way shock Netflix." Desmond smiled to himself as he walked past. For the first time, gossip didn't sting. It served as confirmation. Helen had indeed written the last chapter. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Her death didn't silence her. It amplified the truth she lived for years. And now, Desmond carried that truth, not as a burden, but as a blueprint for what remained of his life. The final Sunday of that month came with a sky so clear it felt like glass. Desmond dressed in white for no occasion, just instinct. He walked to Helen's grave alone, carrying nothing but a bouquet of wildflowers picked from her garden. The cemetery was quiet, the trees still, the grass freshly trimmed. He knelt beside her tombstone, brushed a leaf off the engraved name, and placed the flowers gently at the base. "You were right," he said aloud, though no one else was there. "You planned everything, and I didn't see it until you were gone. But I see now." He sat there for a while, legs stretched, hands folded on his lap like a student listening to a quiet lesson. "Lawrence is doing well. He's steady. Soft like you, but stronger than I expected. You raised him well, even from a distance." The breeze picked up slightly, and a single petal lifted from the bouquet and drifted toward the grave's edge, landing like a bow at the end of a dance. "I've started something too," Desmond continued. "Small, but honest, for children who don't know how to be heard. I figured maybe that's how I start again, by helping someone else find their voice." He stood slowly, adjusted the bouquet, and smiled, genuine, gentle, the kind of smile that can only come after truth has swept through a man's life like a cleansing fire. As he turned to leave, the wind whispered once more, soft as Helen's voice. He didn't need to hear words. He already knew what they'd be. And with that, he walked back home, lighter, slower, but no longer hollow. Sometimes, the loudest truth is the one no one sees coming. If someone chooses silence over revenge, it doesn't mean they're weak. It means they're wise. Don't wait until it's too late to value loyalty, because when real love walks away, what's left behind is just echoes. Guard your actions in secret the way you'd want to be remembered in public. Because one day, what you buried will rise, and it won't always rise in your favor. May your heart never be so proud that it misses true love when it stands right beside you. May the silence of the ones you hurt never become the loudest part of your regret. May every wrong you've done be replaced with the wisdom to do right. May those who've cried because of you find peace, and may you find the grace to be better than your past. May favor meet you even in your failures, and may restoration find you where apology cannot reach. May the story of your life end with peace, not punishment. In Jesus' name, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.